You know, if I was a werewolf, I would just eat sandwiches instead of people. I'm sorry, what? If I was a werewolf, I would just eat sandwiches instead of people. Werewolves can't make sandwiches. Yeah, they can. They have opposable thumbs. Look, I'm not having this discussion with you. It's because you know I'm right. Whatever. The two were settling in after a long day, the dust tiptoeing on the horizon. The smell of popcorn danced through the cool ventilated air. The familiar sound of candy wrappers being opened was drowned out by the sound of the TV speakers. Hurry up, the movie's about to start. Her voice cut through the radioactive hum of the microwave. Well, just pause the movie. His response echoed from the kitchen to the living room. Or you could just hurry up. The grating beep of the microwave pulled the young man's attention away from his antsy girlfriend. He popped up at the door and grabbed the hot bag of popcorn, still steam puffed and popping slightly. He poured the contents of the butter-coated bag into a large green bowl, and with his movie theater-style snack in hand, he galloped to the darkened living room, his less than agile movements highlighted by the rapidly changing colors of the TV screen. Hey, scoot over, that's my spot. Your spot? Yeah, that's my butt groove, so scoot. I was wondering why I dipped down so low here. Wait, did you just call me fat? No, you're cuddly. Yeah, well, thanks for clarifying. He sat down his usual spot, cradling the popcorn in his lap as she took her usual position next to him. So what'd you put on? His voice muffled by a mouthful of popcorn. Drop dead diva. What? Why? Calm down, I'm just playing. Put on a zombie movie. Oh, yeah, good, good. The opening credits began to flash on the screen. The far-off sounds of groans and screams poured in through the speakers, filling the room with an ominous ambiance. I'm just saying, people would wake up like, what's that sound? Then they go to the kitchen and see a big-ass werewolf just making a sandwich like, yo, where the mayo at? An amused smile edged its way across his rounded face. She grabbed the bowl from him and placed it on the old wooden coffee table before laying down and placing her head on his lap. Shh, the movie's starting. He looked down, watching the reflection of the TV's gleam in her aqua eyes, her skin kissed lightly by the technicolor glow. He ran his fingers through her wavy brunette locks, the scent of her discount shampoo sticking to his hand, aromatic evidence of his affection. She watched the CGI-heavy chaos on the screen, indulging in her love's gentle caress. Her eyelids growing heavy, her consciousness fading off into a sleepy tango of comfort and lethargy. Blinking became a struggle, a hopeless battle she was slowly losing until she gave in to sleep. Babe, wake up, let's go to the bedroom. He squeezed her arm lightly. Huh? Let's go to bed. Oh, okay. She sat up and wiped a small trail of drool from her cheek and then began to lumber her way through the living room. Was the movie any good? Nope, but by the time I realized that, I was too invested and couldn't quit watching. Well, at least I didn't miss anything. Yeah, well, go ahead and get some sleep. I'm going to make a little snack before I go to bed. Her feet, heavy with exhaustion, danced a clumsy trail to the ever-welcoming bedroom, running her hand along the wall of the 8-foot hallway to help guide herself through the corridor. She dove face first in the cool embrace of the cotton polyester blend bedsheets that lay ravaged from the previous night's escapades. Grabbing her pillow and losing herself within the fibers of the gray and white comforter, she began to doze off again. The unmistakable sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of an empty mayonnaise jar serenading her to sleep. Her hungry lover's lullaby. A smile spread across her face as she began to fall back asleep. She sprung to life, her slumber interrupted by the deafening sound of wood splintering under immense pressure. The solid thud that emanated from the living room echoed throughout the house. Panicked, she turned in search of her boyfriend, but he was nowhere to be found. The faint sound of a voice crashed through the discord that invaded in the night. It was a voice foreign to her ears that emerged from somewhere down the hall, a raspy tone with a nervous cadence. His words were inaudible, but the unmelodious rhythm in which he spoke carried a foreboding sense of hysteria. She carefully slid from the bed, standing on the tips of her feet, silently stepping out across the hardwood floor. She looked out past the door, the straight light that escaped from the kitchen spilling into the dim hallway. The voice of the stranger grew louder and more agitated. Slowly, she stepped forward through the hallway, cautiously maneuvering through the minefield of squeaky floorboards. She slid her hand over the wall once again, this time to balance herself as she crept closer to the kitchen. The stranger's voice grew erratic, volatile. His pitch deepened and lashed out with a sense of troubled tension. His whispers burst bellows as a cacophony spiraled around her. The ballistic thunder echoed through the hushed corridor. A bright flash lit the darkness like lightning in the night sky. A familiar burnt smell brought to mind thoughts of the 4th of July. She stood motionless, awestruck, until the slight burn in her chest reminded her that she had been holding in her breath. With a slight gasp, she awoke from her reverie and listened. The voice had grown quiet. The only sound that could now be heard was a gurgled cough, eking its way into existence. Something compelled her to move forward, a morbid need to know. Sliding her socks over the wooden floor nearer to the kitchen, her heart dropped. A familiar face lay on the ground, his blood-stained hands clutching at the hole in his chest. A small pool of crimson puddled around him, working its way into the cracks of the off-white linoleum tiling. His panicked eyes made contact with her, but her attention was quickly drawn away by the figure of the stranger who stood towering over her injured lover. The pistol in his hand still smoking, the soot-laden vapor twisting and twirling from the barrel. Her vision blurred, tears filling her eyes. An involuntary choke sneaked from between her pursed lips. The stranger leaped in surprise, jerking his body around and aiming his gun hastily. His muscles tensed and the trigger pulled. A burst of light cascaded from the handgun, sending a lead slug slamming into the wall. The drywall cracked and crumbled, a plume of dust and gnarled plaster marking the gunman's inaccuracy. She stumbled in fright, falling backwards. She slid back slightly on the slick floor, backpedaling on her palms and heels. The stranger called out to her, his words muffled by the sounds of her heavy sobbing. He took aim, the nickel-plated barrel spoke volumes. She froze in place, biting her tongue, silencing her forlorn whimpers. He stood over her, his face obscured by the shadows that cast themselves through the kitchen. A metallic click sang out as he retracted the hammer of the silver revolver with his thumb. She took one last look at her lover, who still lay on the floor, gasping, trying desperately to hold on to the life that slowly seeped through his blood-soaked shirt. She closed her eyes and listened for the revolver's final violent whisper, but what she heard wasn't the sulfur-laced song of the 38 Special, but rather a chuckle. Weakened gasp turned to laughter, which later turned to something entirely more sinister. The gargled laughter evolved to a growl, a visceral snarl laden with the guttural viciousness of a feral animal. She opened her eyes only to wish that she hadn't. Her lover was no longer lying on the floor, but on his hands and knees. His body tensed and his muscles bulged, so much so that it seemed his skin may tear, trying to contain the mass. He began pounding his fist into the ground before rising to his knees and releasing an animalistic howl. The sound shook the walls of the small home, causing the old incandescent bulb to flicker. The faint sound of bones cracking followed suit as his body began to change. His muscles continued to grow well beyond the elasticity of his skin. His flesh ripped, giving way to a graying hide thick with wet, red-stained fur. His fingers popped and snapped like dried twigs as they extended. Sharp talons split his fingertips as claws sprouted from his cuticles. The shape of his legs shifted and contorted into an unnatural bend, warping into a digigrade stance. His jaw fractured and unhinged. His ivory smile broke and crumbled. His teeth fell from his jaw one by one. His mouth, now a pool of blood and saliva, bore fangs and pointed teeth. His once broad and rounded facial features twisted and sharpened as they shifted and elongated. He stood on his hind legs, heaving and panting. His dark coat shimmered in the silver moonlight that peeked into the kitchen's mini blinds. No longer a man, but a beast. She looked on in horror and disbelief. Her mind raced, but her body refused to respond. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but all she could do was stare. Her trance was finally broken by the terrified screams of the stranger and the concussive blast of his weapon. The bullets found their target sinking deep into the gray pelt, but the beast still stood. With a venereal roar, he pounced on his prey, knocking him down to the ground, sending the revolver sliding across the floor. He slashed at the stranger over and over again, his razor-sharp claws tearing into the stranger's torso. A crimson rain sprinkled down with each blow from the beast. The stranger cried and shouted as the beast minced flesh and sinew alike, wrapping his fanged jaws around the stranger's neck and clamping down. He ended his screams, blood pooling at the back of the stranger's throat. A final cough punctuated his death. She watched as the beast mauled the man who broke into her home. She watched as the beast buried his teeth into the stranger's neck. And she watched as the beast rose to his hind legs. He turned to her, a scarlet smile painted across his mouth. She regained control of her body and began to crawl back when she saw the silver revolver next to her. She dove for the gun and scrambled to her feet. Gripping the weapon with both hands, she took aim, struggling to steady the barrel as she trembled in fear. The beast stepped forward, his head lowered. No, don't come any closer. The wood of the floorboards creaked as the beast took another step. Stop, I'll shoot. The beast grew nearer, blood dripped from his teeth and claws. Stop, just stop. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. A metallic click met her ears. She was out of bullets. Her eyes still closed tight. She heard the sound of sniffing, followed by a curious whine. As she opened her eyes, she saw the beast, his snout pressed lightly against the barrel of the gun. He stared up at her. His soft, dark chocolate eyes held a familiar gleam. Babe? The beast stared at her, his head cocked slightly to the side before he began to sniff the air. His eyes sharpened as he lurched past her. She watched on as the beast made his way to the kitchen, his once precise predatory movements now replaced by a slightly clumsy gallop which led him to an unexpected collision with the stove. The once ravenous creature regained his balance and began to paw at something on the countertop. The sound of a ceramic plate crashing on the floor snapped her out of her stupor. What are you doing? She strained her eyes to see what he had knocked down to the ground. She dropped the revolver and smiled as the beast began to devour the half-eaten sandwich that now lay on the kitchen floor.